Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is the Vulgar Marxist, and tonight I regret to inform you that CPUSA climbed on that motorcycle, gunned that engine, and jumped that shark. In what I am certain is going to be portrayed as the most important election season of all election seasons that have ever been held, CPUSA is once again hurling workers under the bus to make room for every single group imaginable other than workers. Now, before we proceed, I am not a fan of the MAGA communism. As far as I am concerned, Caleb Maupin absolutely did everything he's accused of. As far as I am concerned, Infra Has, whatever his actual name is a gibbering idiot. I've talked to him personally. He has no clue what he's talking about. It took me all of 5 minutes to get him to admit he's a capitalist. So, I am not saying this out of any sympathy to the people CPUSA is deliberately attacking. I am saying this out of sheer unadulterated frustration with the fact that the attack they are using, the theories, the foundation, the praxis they are adopting to commit this attack is a neoliberal praxis. It is the ideology of neoliberalism they are regurgitating in the points they are making when they attempt to attack MAGA communism. And I am shocked and appalled they are doing this. This needs to be corrected immediately. By me, if by no one else. So, before we proceed, when I present an article, I do a text-to-speech recording of the article so as to not allow my personal distaste with the article to affect the recording in any way, thereby allowing you, my audience, to get the clearest understanding without any confusion as to what the article is saying. However, the text-to-speech system I use has a limit of 5,000 characters. I have had to cut a couple of paragraphs out of this article, and I am posting the full article in the background so you can see the parts I have removed. They weren't substantive, it was pure fluff. But I want to be absolutely clear with you that one, I have had to remove a paragraph in order to make the article fit, and you may read for yourself which paragraph I have removed to determine that it was not in point of fact central to the article as presented. Now, we shall proceed.
In the early to mid-2010s, a new generation of black people in America began to understand the connectivity of police violence, economic oppression, and disenfranchisement under the capitalist system. In 2012 we saw a child, Trayvon Martin, murdered at the hands of a vigilante wannabe cop. In 2014 we saw the murder of Mike Brown and Eric Garner at the hands of actual cops. Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Elijah McClain, Walter Wallace, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and many other black Americans were all murdered by police officers or white bystanders in the last 10 years. In that time, many black people began using the phrase, "stay woke," as a reminder to our community that our experience under capitalism is one that is undeniably different from the white experience.
It's not. Let me say this very clearly right now for anyone who is confused about the situation. It is not different. Read about the coal miners in England in the 17th and 18th century. Read about the coal miners in West Virginia in the 18th and 19th century. Read about how the Irish were treated under English rule. Read about how Russia was treated under literally anyone prior to Lenin. The history of strike actions in the United States alone shows that the capitalists will gun down anyone who stands in their way. Railroad strikes in St. Louis, mine strikes in Pennsylvania and Ohio, factory strikes everywhere. There were riots in Chicago where the police just walked in and opened fire. It has always been the way of capitalists to beat, stab, and shoot anyone trying to resist them, white, black, Chinese, or any other color, completely indiscriminately. The difference here is that European Americans figured out systems to prevent the capitalists from doing this. Now, we will happily teach these to African Americans, but let it never be confused. The very second they are able to, the capitalists will absolutely direct violence against any worker of any color for any reason.
Of course, the far right has a problem with the black community recognizing and understanding their oppression. Acting on the belief that these movements were built on entitlement, wokeness became a dog whistle for any resistance by oppressed groups against their oppressors. Black Lives Matter, along with the LGBTQ equality movement, Me Too, and even the Land Back movement, all became demonized as liberal ID-pol wokeness.
I'm going to have to do a video later on why land back is inherently anti-Marxist. But for the time being, I'd like to draw attention to the bait and switch that has just occurred. The author did not say Marxist, or communist, or socialist, or leftist. The author said liberal. When a communist says liberal, we are not referring to a general left of center politics. We are referring either to classical or Neo Liberalism, both of which we staunchly oppose as inherently anti-worker. So why would we have any reason to defend a movement that is liberal? Now, you might argue that a movement is being misframed as liberal. That is an argument you could make. But that's not the argument the author is making. The author is making the argument that these movements being framed as liberal means we ought to defend them. Why would we do that? Why would we defend neoliberal anything? And I'm not saying this out of hand. We will get into this further as the article proceeds. But let me be very clear at this point. The entire crux of this argument is that a communist movement should defend social movements that are inherently neoliberal.
We are now seeing a new surge of anti-wokeness among people who consider themselves Marxists. Although they are not always using the same vernacular as the far right, their bigoted attacks serve the same purpose, to delegitimize genuine workers' resistance against oppression. While they see democratic struggles and class struggle as two distinct fights, with the class struggle taking primacy, we understand that democratic struggles are a vital part of the class struggle.
They aren't. They are not two distinct struggles. The entire purpose of class struggle is to democratize the workplace. It is a single struggle. It is one single unified struggle towards total democracy at all levels, in all places, and at all times. I don't see anyone disagreeing with that on our side of this. I've talked to Has. He's an idiot, but he does not seem, as best I can figure, to disagree with the idea that the workers ought to be represented in the places they are employed. So, arguing that one or the other struggle has primacy is ridiculous. There is only the emancipation of the laboring class. There is nothing else. There are no two struggles. There is one single unified struggle, and one struggle only. This is, incidentally, what is meant when it is said ID-pol is divisive. ID-pol, by prioritizing this or that specific struggle, deflects attention away from the overall struggle towards total democratization. It's a distraction, a deflection. We will go into this more later. Again, I'm going to be very, 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 very thorough with this. I am not going to cut corners here. I'm going to be extremely clear in my takedown of this article. Prioritizing this or that group's problems ignores the fact that the overall problems are massively larger, and the group will gain more ground addressing the overall problems instead of addressing the problems they are facing specifically.
The fight for black liberation, women's liberation, queer liberation, and indigenous liberation is the fight to advance the working class toward total socialist liberation. William Z. Foster, longtime CPUSA member and party chair, understood that to win over the masses, special consideration must be made to workers who face super-exploitation. In his book Toward Soviet America, he says, the capitalist class not only robs the workers as a whole, but it visits special exploitation upon those sections of the working class, Negroes, foreign-born, women, youth, the aged, etc., who, for one reason or another, are the least able to defend themselves in the class struggle.
What incoherent, gibbering bullshit. If I swing a sledgehammer at a cinder block and an egg, I will severely damage the cement block and utterly destroy the egg. It is not that special oppression is visited upon these people. These people are the least able to defend themselves. The same oppression is visited upon everyone. Let me say this once more. Capitalists will brutalize, hurt, and destroy anything they can, because that is how they make their money. The difference is that European Americans, specifically males, having endured dozens, if not hundreds of generations of this brutality, have built specific systems to defend themselves against it. Whereas other groups, either because they are inherently vulnerable, such as children, or because they lack experience with the capitalist exploitative system, have not developed these defenses to the extent which European American males have developed them. It is the job of the Communist Party to summarize and present these defenses in the most clear way possible to those groups who have not yet learned them. This is not anything special. This is simply, hey, we found this really awesome way not to get hurt. You should probably do this. We should not hand them some superior benefit because capitalism is hurting them exactly the same way it's hurting everyone else. They just haven't learned how to defend themselves yet. We should teach them how to defend themselves from exactly the same exploitation everyone else is facing.
From the early days of our party's history, our leaders understood the relationship between class and special oppression. Claudia Jones expands on Foster's thoughts with her analysis of the triply oppressed working black woman. In her article, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, she argued that Negro women, as workers, as Negroes, and as women, are the most oppressed stratum of the whole population. At the time, black women who had to work to live, single or married, were excluded from almost all jobs, except the most underpaid ones. This was just one play from the age-old capitalist playbook: drive down wages as much as possible to extract the maximum amount of surplus labor value for profit.
How do capitalists extract value of surplus labor? We all know the answer. By inflating the Industrial Reserve Army. Capitalism wasn't possible prior to the Enclosure Acts. There weren't enough workers. The peasants earned their income by tilling the fields. The cities were very nearly empty. The craft guilds locked down and controlled everything. There was no way to have a factory of any substantial size because there was no one to staff it. and the Enclosure Acts came. The peasants were driven off the fields into the cities, and all of a sudden, look at all these starving, hungry people who will sell their labor for a fraction of its value. Marx calls it the Industrial Reserve Army or the Reserve Army of Labor, take your pick. In modern terms, we call it supply and demand. When the supply of a commodity, i.e. labor, increases, prices fall, in this case, wages. This is perfectly observable in modern times. The entry of women into the labor market tanked wages in the 1970s. They've never recovered. This was observable last year, when a 3% reduction in labor force, because people didn't come back from COVID, caused wages at McDonald's, Walmart, and Burger King to increase by 50%, sometimes more. A ton of small businesses went under. A lot of truck stops, a lot of restaurants, because they couldn't afford to pay $16, $17, $18 an hour for cash register attendants and waitstaff. We understand how this works. Anyone who's studied a 101 level econ course understands how this works. The less people sell labor, the more everyone gets paid. The more people sell labor, the less everyone gets paid. So why is CPUSA repeating the neoliberal notion that more people working is a good thing? Any communist understands that in the capitalist system, less people working is a good thing because that drives up wages. This is the second bait and switch CPUSA has pulled in the space of 2 paragraphs, and I am becoming deeply concerned this is not an accident. It is entirely possible that they are very, very deliberately starting with a communist talking point, flipping the script, and coming up with neoliberal answers for a problem communists would not recognize as existing. Less people working is never a bad thing in a capitalist society because less people working means wages go up.
The oppression of marginalized groups, such as the black community, serves to justify and reinforce this super-exploitation. Liberative unity among the broad mass of proletarians must be predicated on the eradication of the oppression of working black women, as they serve as the benchmark for the oppression of all workers. How do we as communists build unity for working-class liberation that puts the most oppressed, the working black woman, at the forefront of our struggle? Let's look at the current economic struggle of black women. The average wage of a black woman sits at about $13 per hour, whereas the white man makes almost $10 more an hour at $21 per hour.
And here we get into the meat of what I've been talking about. The GDP of the United States is $21 trillion. It is produced by 273 billion hours of work. This gives us a GDP per hour of $76. Why are we fussing about the difference between $13 an hour and $21 an hour instead of arguing that all workers should be paid $75 an hour or even $76 an hour because that is the value they are producing? More importantly, how is this a defense of IDPOL or an attack on anyone who opposes it? I certainly would have no objection at all to African American women earning $80 an hour, while I, a European American male, earn $70 an hour. $70 an hour for a 60-hour week, it's $200-something thousand a year. I could retire in 10 years at that kind of pay. What do I care how much the African American woman earns? And again, is there anyone in the Magna Communism movement that would oppose this? That would say they cannot possibly stand to earn $70 an hour while an African American woman is earning $80 an hour? Show them to me. Point them to me right now. I can't imagine anyone having a meaningful objection to that scenario. But instead of beginning with the premise that we should claim for ourselves the full value of the labor of our two hands, CPUSA regurgitates the neoliberal talking point of fighting over the scraps on the floor, and how we need look no higher than those scraps.
As black people attempt to improve their wealth through education, with 41% of young black women and 33% of young black men enrolling in college as of 2018, they hold almost twice as much student debt as white students. Black women have accrued the most debt, with an average of about $44,200 owed after graduation. This glaring disparity gives us a microcosmic glance at the profound effects of capitalist super-exploitation.
Lies. All of it lies. There is no relation between education and the improvement of aggregate wages. None. None whatsoever. There never has been. The education level of Americans has nearly tripled since the 1940s, while aggregate wages have stumbled along at nearly the same rate the entire time, particularly for middle-income families. The idea that education has any relation to wages at all is a petty bourgeoisie lie perpetuated by neoliberals to pretend that there is a road up and a road forward, when in point of fact there is none and there never ever was. Right now in the United States, less than 10% of adults go to college, get a degree, and get a job in the field they study. The overwhelming majority of graduates will do absolutely nothing related to their field with the degree they have earned. Many will not even go anywhere near a job that requires a college degree in the first place. They might as well have not gone at all. The entire idea that education leads to advancement is yet another bourgeoisie trick. It sets up a process of people fighting each other for an extremely small and limited number of opportunities dictated by the bourgeoisie. There are not college jobs for everyone. There were never college jobs for everyone, and so long as we continue the capitalist system, even if we get rid of it, there will still probably not be college jobs for everyone, because we simply don't need that many people doing those jobs. The correct framing of this question from a Marxist perspective is not how do we get more college jobs. The correct framing of this question from a Marxist perspective is what do we do with the 90% of people who will never get to have one? Why should anyone require a college education in order to earn a basic standard of living? Why should anyone require a college education in order to be paid the value they themselves have labored to create? This wasn't even a question in previous eras. Read Proudhon, read Kropotkin. It was understood with absolute and total clarity that the idea that those with advanced degrees ought to be paid more was circular reasoning. That a janitor, assuming the argumentation an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is 16 times as useful to society as a doctor is, because the janitor deals with a disease before it spreads, whereas the doctor deals with a disease after it spreads. There is no reason in Marxism to care whether you have a degree or not, because all persons deserve an equal share of the value all have labored to create.
With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and other democratic movements, we are seeing the beginnings of a genuine workers' movement. The support for BLM among Black Americans has remained high at 83%. Unlike in past movements for Black liberation, communists were not sufficiently organized enough to play a leading role during the 2020 uprisings. This led to unsatisfactory results, despite blood, sweat, and tears from our community. We must now be ready to quickly entrench ourselves in the BLM movement as demonstrators and organizers to advance the struggle on Black working class terms and be unrelenting in our demands. This is not an embrace of liberal identity politics, this is understanding of where we are, who we are, and how we get to socialism.
You are regurgitating liberal talking points based on liberal assumptions, with liberal solutions and liberal excuses. So yes, I'm afraid what you are doing is, in point of fact, entirely liberal IDPol. That's what you're doing. If it walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, and floats like a duck, it's a duck. IDPol is neoliberal bullshit. It is neoliberalism dressed up at Marxism, snuck into our movement by people who are trying to undermine everything we are working on, because they earnestly do not desire democratic accountability in the workplace. They don't want everyone to make $70 an hour. They want everyone to be happy with their $15 an hour, and that's good enough because you're a scumbag and that's all you need. They are trying to maintain the status quo of some get ahead and everyone else gets left behind, and merely change who it is who's getting ahead. There is a wonderful quotation. I need to find where I heard this. I honestly don't remember. If society is a banquet laid out for the few, with the many forced to fight over the scraps that fall to the floor, then my goal is not to rearrange the occupants of the chairs, it is the abolition of the table itself. Now, as I said, I cut the last paragraph of this article off. You're free to read it if you wish. It doesn't say very much. It just goes babbling on about how Black Lives Matter is important in this election and communists need to leap to the forefront of Black Lives Matter. I would like to point out, I'm not even going to bother going to get the screenshot. If you look at the BLM Wikipedia page, it is very, very obvious that it's been taken over by the Democrats. There were huge BLM protests in 2016. For 4 years, there was dead silence. And I don't believe for a single second that not one African American was shot in those 4 years. I'm sure dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of African Americans were shot by police in those 4 years. But until 2020, there was not a word from BLM. And all of a sudden, huge protests for the 2020 election. Riots in Chicago, buildings set on fire. This entire movement has been astroturfed. I'm sure originally it was legitimate. I am completely certain that in 2015, 2016, BLM was a 100% organic movement. It has been co-opted. And we need to take extreme care that the co-option of BLM does not turn into the co-option of the Communist Party.